Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sue Pritchard. I'm Director of the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission here at the RSA, and it is my very, very great pleasure to welcome you all here in the room and following on the live stream to today's event, and to introduce you to our distinguished guest speaker, Mike Berners-Lee. Mike is the founder of the sustainability consultancy Small World Consulting, a professor at Lancaster University's Institute for Social Futures and an expert in sustainable food systems and carbon metrics. He's the author of a number of important and influential books, including The Burning Question and How Bad Are Bananas? The Carbon Footprint of Everything. He joins us today to share insights from his new book, There Is No Planet B, a handbook for the make or break years. You can see I've been leafing through mine extensively already, in which he offers us a big picture look at the environmental, the social and the economic challenges that face us. And most importantly, perhaps, a practical course of action to get us all started on making a difference. It's a topic that is really important to us here at the RSA, of course, where in projects such as the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, we've been working hard to develop a deeper and a shared understanding of what needs to change and how change happens in readiness for our final report in July. And my colleagues elsewhere in the building are applying the thinking to what we choose to work on, the way we design our research, how we mobilise our fellowship network, and how we engage the wider public. So it really is a particular pleasure to hear from Mike today, and I am so looking forward to learning an enormous amount from our conversation. I'll be taking extensive notes, and to hearing your thoughts and your comments too in our discussion after. There'll be plenty of time for you to contribute before we wrap up at 2. And don't forget, if you're joining us online, you can get involved in the conversation on Twitter. The hashtag is RSA Planet. So let's get started. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Mike Berners-Lee.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for coming. So there's no Planet B. So, you know, I've written a couple of books around climate change, and the last one was kind of with Duncan Clark, was trying to be the big picture on climate change. And we hear about, you know, other environmental challenges that are going on, biodiversity and plastics and pollutions and, you know, all sorts. And it's clear that actually, if we want to deal effectively with any of these things, then we need to see them all as symptoms of something much bigger that is going on. So let's have a look at what that bigger thing is going to be. I should just say, by the way, this is going to be a sprint talk. This is the shortest amount of time I've ever talked about this book for, so let's see how it goes. So what is this bigger thing that's going on? So here's just a graph of human energy use since going back to, can't quite see the bottom, 1850 and up to now. The last 50 years it's been going up by 2.4% per year on average, and the century before that only about 1% per year, and before that at a lower rate. But it's been going up all this time anyway. And whilst it's been going up, we've also been getting more efficient in our use of energy, so we can do more with each kilowatt hour. And also we've been getting more inventive about the things we can do, new chemicals, new plastics, new bombs, new ways of traveling, all sorts of things. And the upshot is that our influence on this planet through a mixture of accident and design has been going up steeply. 2.4% a year is a factor of 10 every century. And for a long time, we were still in this context where we could get away with thinking of ourselves as a little species running around on a big, robust planet. And recently, really recently, that changed. And we find ourselves in a completely new context. So here's my little sketch for it. Some people use this big word, the Anthropocene, but it basically just means suddenly we're in an era where the big things that happen in the environment are because we cause them. And we used to be able to get away with running around, treating the planet like this, and now suddenly it's like this. And that's such a radical change in context. And it's not surprising that it's unclear. You know, now we're here, how much of everything about how we think about life, how we do economics, how we run society, how we do politics, how we think, how we solve problems, how much of that is still fit for purpose in this new era, and how much of it isn't? And if we can how can we spot the bits that aren't? And even more to the point, once we've spotted them, how on earth do we change them? And so here in this new context, we're facing a load of challenges that are, they're all joined up. It's a systemic problem, and it's not just science and technology, it's mixed up with every discipline you can think of. And like it or not, that's how we have to think about the problems. It doesn't work any longer to think about climate change over here, and then with a separate hat, think about biodiversity over here. And with a separate hat, again, think about things like inequality, and have it all looked at one thing at a time. So here's the book. This is my attempt to cover it all off in one hit. And because it's not really a linear story, it's not one thing at a time, what I'm going to do is keep quiet for a few minutes, and you just all stare at the page and absorb the whole lot in one go, because that's really ideally the way you look at it. But there it is. It's designed to be my attempt to put everything in one place, because however hard it is, we have to hold it all in our heads at the same time, simultaneously. And you can see it's packed full of kind of stats and graphs and analysis of every kind. And the reason I've put that in is because they are intended to be perspective-forcing analyses and some of them I think make your eyes pop out with how are we doing this to the planet, and how come we're living like this when we could be living like this, and how much opportunity there is to do things better. For speed, I'm going to skip over this, but I do cover off with some very simple physics this question of, is there really no planet B? Because I think it is getting some traction. Some people have got in the back of their heads, well, maybe it's Star Trek, we're all brought up with it, and Elon Musk goes on about it, and it actually takes some very simple physics to say that, to show that for the next foreseeable generations, we really are stuck on our beautiful planet A. I'm going to whiz through that for speed. But just to give a sort of a collage of some of the things that are going on all together. So we've got biodiversity that we're hearing a bit about, not enough about as we need to. And all these species, one of them is us, of course, more and more of us every year. And we live on this beautiful planet, but we're filling it up with plastics and other chemicals, other pollutants as well. And we all have to eat somehow with some diet or other, and that food has to come from somewhere. Some of it comes from places like that. So, factory chicken farm, some of it comes from places like that, some of it comes from here, which is where I live, in the Lake District. And then that's just depicting antibiotics, and 2/3 of our antibiotics are fed to farm animals, and you haven't got to think long about a world in which antibiotics don't work to get a bit scared about it. And then, of course, finally, onto our energy supply, and some of our energy comes from places like that, and some from a little bit from solar panels, and a tiny bit from wind turbines, and there's a symptom of climate change. And we all have to live somewhere, and some people live in places like that, and some people live in places like that. And one of the questions is it actually possible to deal with all these environmental challenges? Is it possible to do that in a world in which we've got all this level of inequality going on, or not? Even if you just look at it from a practical perspective, does that level of inequality actually stop us from dealing with any of these other things? So that's a little collage of it, and here it is in words. So the physical challenges, energy, climate change, food, ocean acidification, antibiotics, doesn't quite fit. That says population down there at the bottom. Transport, other pollution, plastics, biodiversity, all these things that we have to look at in a joined up way. And I'll give you the one-liner on it. The good news is that from a technical perspective, it turns out we can solve all these things. We can deal with all these things. Isn't that fantastic? So the question is, what would it take for us to be solving these technically solvable challenges? And that takes us into a whole other array of stuff. So we've got questions about growth, questions about what growth is still okay. Is all growth bad? Is some growth good? Is some growth essential? Which bits of growth do we have to ditch, and if so, how? Technology. We talk about technology as if we invent it, so we must be in control of it, right? But is that really right? So there's a big dynamic going on in which our energy supply is going up and our technology is going up, and it brings us lots of great things, but one of the things it's done is taken us into the Anthropocene, and that's taken us into a situation in which we are going to be in a lot of trouble very quickly if we don't deal with that if the quality of our stewardship doesn't radically change? And are we actually in sufficient control of the way technology develops, or are we on some kind of trajectory? Are we on some sort of treadmill trajectory that's going up and up and up, whether we like it or not, with increasing burden on the planet? So huge implications for business and politics and economics, of course, and connected to that are metrics and questions of inequality. And then sort of getting closer to the heart of the book, questions about truth and trust, and then values. And then the concluding chapter is about ways of thinking skills and habits that perhaps we need to get much better at suddenly, very quickly, if we're going to deal with this new context of the Anthropocene. Okay, now I'm going to get into some of the detail, and it's just going to be excerpts from the detail of some of that green stuff around the edge, the physical challenges we have to deal with. So quickly, a look at food, land, and sea. Just a few things. So this is analysis we did at Lancaster, looking at just the big picture on the global food system. So tracing the world's calories, but we did this for all the other human essential nutrients as well: protein, vitamin A, iron, zinc, and others. So this is the green represents. Sorry, the text is a bit small. I'll talk you through it. So the green is the nearly 6,000 calories per person per day at the global level that we grow. Isn't that fantastic? Coming on for about 2.5 times what we need. And on top of that, farm animals also eat this much grass, pasture, and stover that we can't digest, but they can. That's another 4,000 calories per person per day, per human person per day. And in every region, there's a surplus as well. So in America, it's something like 20,000 calories per person per day, or coming on for that. But even in Africa and all the other continents, there's still a good surplus at the global level. And you can do this, as I say, not just for calories, but if I were to do this for protein, we'd see a very similar story to the one I'm just about to show you for calories. So let's have a look at these calories in crops on their journey through the food system. So a little bit gets lost here in harvest losses, about 340. That's okay, there's still plenty. We could reduce that, but it's hard to take it to zero. And a bit gets lost post-harvest in storage, mainly in the developing world, for want of good storage facilities. We can reduce that, but not probably to zero. There's still plenty. So what comes next is really interesting. We work out what to do with all these edible crops that we've grown and harvested and stored. The little yellow slither here is the bit that we keep as seeds so we can eat next year as well. That's a good idea. The blue chunk here is non-food uses, which is almost all biofuel. And that's not necessarily bad, but I'll just describe the trade-off. So if we grow enough wheat to give me all the calories that I need for the day, and if instead with that wheat we turn it into a biofuel so that I can power my small 1 litre petrol car, Citroen C1, it will give me enough biofuel to power that car for 1 mile. Right? So that's a day's worth of calories against 1 mile in a small car. Now, I could use a second-generation biofuel, maybe a cellulose crop, maybe get it up to 5 miles, but it's still an incredibly steep trade-off. And if I were to try and power all today's aviation, for example, using biofuel, the calorie sacrifice will be something like 2,000 calories per person per day for everyone on the planet. Massive. So that's biofuel. We keep this in the food supply, that's good, and we feed this chunk here 17,000 calories a day. 1,700 calories per person per day to farm animals. So the farm animals eat this and this, and then what happens? They give us back this red bit, nearly 600 in meat and dairy, and all this gets lost by doing inefficient things like walking around and keeping warm and stuff like that. So there's a huge, huge inefficiency we build into the food system by putting food through animals. And of course, this land here, some of it could be used for biodiversity, some of it could be used for, some but not all could be used for human crops, and some of it could probably appropriately be fed to farm animals. But this is nearly 3/4 of all the calorific need of humanity. And then we lose a bit through distribution and processing losses. We can trim those as well. And then consumers waste a lot, especially in countries like ours. But there's still a surplus, and there's a net excess consumption. So that's the basic map of the food system. And You can do this at a regional level as well. And we've done it for all the micronutrients, and you get a very similar story. So what does it tell us? It tells us we need to watch biofuels like crazy. They're not necessarily bad, but if we had a low-carbon world and we let the free market do its thing in the food system, we'd just see this expanding at the expense of the green chunk, and it'd be disastrous. We see that if we could just stop feeding human edible crops to farm animals, we would liberate so much spare capacity in the food system for feeding that rising population, making sure everyone's properly nourished, and also dealing with our biodiversity while that we urgently need to do. We can see it's self-explanatory, but we can see that it's good to reduce all the losses and wastes, but they're not the biggest story in here. It's not as big a story as our diets and our animal farming. We don't need to go vegetarian or vegan necessarily, but it's all about proportions. We do need to see big changes in proportions at the global level and especially in countries like ours over not many years. And we also see, what else is interesting about this, is that there is a net surplus. So why does anybody go hungry? It's not because there isn't enough food. It's to do with, and you could increase this and there would still be some people not getting enough nutrition, particularly of the other nutrients, protein and iron and zinc and vitamin A and stuff. And that boils down to, do the supply chains bother to find their way to every mouth? And that takes us into questions of inequality. And if you've got a piece of land and you can either use it for biofuel for somebody's private jet, or you can use it to grow the food that somebody else who's got 1/1000th of the wealth knows that if they don't get that food, they're going to die young. Which way does the food supply go? Well, actually, it goes to the biofuel for the person who's 1,000 times richer, or is it the air-freighted asparagus, or whatever? And until we sort that out, we'll always have a world in which some people don't have enough. We could grow the food supplies as much as we want, and we'd still have that problem. Just to emphasize the inefficiency of animals in the system. So this is soybeans and beef, gram for gram, compared against each other. That's calories, protein, iron, and zinc. And the soybeans winning on every front. And yet, if you feed 100 grams of soybeans to the cow, you get back something like 1/10 of the nutrition in milk and beef. I've mentioned antibiotics as well. So when the beef also comes with an antibiotics crisis, and sheep and cows are also serving up their meat with a good helping of methane and greenhouse gases, very powerful greenhouse gas, as you know, and also much of the cattle farming has got deforestation in its supply chains as well. So there's a whole load of environmental reasons why this change in diet is so hugely important. And a really interesting conversation to be had about what the opportunity is for everybody in places like near where I live, this sheep farming. These sheep are eating more intrinsically human edible animal feed than they're giving back in lamb, and the cost of that feed plus the cost of the medicines equals antibiotics is more than the value of the lamb. So there's an opportunity here to do the right thing for the land, and for the farmers at the same time. We just have to be really smart about it. And then this is the greenhouse gases. Here's per 50 grams of protein how much you need in a day. This is from beef and lamb, and down here something like between 20 to 50, a 20th or a 50th is from peas, nuts, all the plant-based protein sources. I'm doing this at speed. I'm not going to tell you the answer. When's a sea bass not a sea bass? Well, I'm actually not going to tell you the answer. You'll have to get the book. But this just to say, this launches us into the whole role of fish and so on, and how we do our fishing, which is tied in with it all. And then just a quick statistic that if all the discarded plastic in the world was cling film, you could wrap the whole world up 1.5 times over. And we've sort of bumbled into that, and now there's, in a way, it's not the most serious part of our environmental crisis, but it's there's something depressing about the way we've sort of bumbled into this situation in which we have no known way of getting rid of this stuff. And when people talk about it biodegrading, they just mean it falling into smaller and smaller pieces. It's still there. Okay, on really quickly to energy and climate change, the next section of the book, and I'm just going to be really, really quick on this, and just put a few headlines. Here's the first headline. So here's the carbon emissions curve, and just to say that it is going up exactly as if humans had never noticed that climate change was an issue. Exactly as if. Not the faintest trace of evidence that this is dipped at all. Isn't that weird, considering we all know people, probably lots of people in this room, me included, and companies and countries with targets and so on, and all the Paris talks? Surely some of this stuff must have led to something. If you add up all the little bits, surely we'd see a difference, right? Why not? Well, the answer turns out to be, I'm not saying this to be depressing, I'm saying this because if we can understand this and get our heads around this, it tells us a lot about what won't work, and it puts us a lot hotter on the case for what could work. So it boils down to what's going on at the global system level. And what we're finding is that there's a dynamic of growth going on, rising energy supply, rising carbon emissions, rising efficiency. And what we're seeing is it's kind of a self-correcting system. You squeeze the balloon in one place, and if you're not careful, it will just pop up elsewhere. One country cuts its emissions, but one way and another, that enables or encourages another country to increase its emissions, maybe by getting the manufacturing done elsewhere, or one country doesn't grow as much as another, or the fossil fuel doesn't get dug up in one place, it gets dug up somewhere else. And we need to interrupt this dynamic at the global system level. There's much more about this in the book. And the book, by the way, has got 14 things about climate change, which is sort of listed out, and then there's an appendix expanded on them with a request, please don't, if you have a choice, please don't vote for any politician who doesn't get and take seriously all these 14 points. So it's a little checklist for you. And this is just it's an old slide from a previous book, actually, this one, but just to make the point, this is how much fossil fuel there is in the world, and this is how much we can burn, this little sliver there, for a 75% chance of staying within 2 degrees, which is, the science is now crystal clear, 2 degrees is really, really dangerous. In fact, 1.5 degrees is more dangerous than we used to think 2 degrees was. And then this is the nub. This is the most important thing to say about climate change in a way is, that's the phenomenon, isn't it? This is the human response to it. And maybe it's just starting to change slightly now. I mean, very interesting time right now. On the one hand, the science is really scarier than it's ever been, not just on climate change, but on a whole load of those other things I've talked about. But on the other hand, there is sign that, maybe there's signs that humanity is actually waking up in a way that I've certainly never seen before. All right, now I've said some difficult news, now some good news, right? So this dot is the scale. This is how much, if we just had a dot that size of solar panels, it could generate enough electricity to replace the entire of humanity's energy supply. Isn't that fantastic? Now, of course, there's a lot of problems in, how are you going to distribute it, and how are you going to store it, and how are you going to change all the infrastructure to be able to work with it, and all the rest of it. And I talk all this through in the book. The top line is, yeah, sure. Yeah. So, 228 miles square. I've drawn a round dot, but 228 miles square. There is no inherent. All those details turn out to be solvable, and there's no inherent reason why we can't do this. There's no great limit on the raw materials required to make those solar panels or all the rest of it. So fantastic. It's just one example of the way we can solve these problems. But I said that our energy supply was growing, right? So what if we had these and it turned out to be just as well as all the fossil fuel? Right? So if we grow our energy supply at the same time as we grow our renewables, it won't help us at all. So let's have a look. So if we do keep growing at the rate we're currently growing at, it'll be like that in 100 years' time, and like that in 200 years' time, and in 300 years' time, there'll be no opportunity for a human on land to have sunlight landing directly on their skin, because we will need the whole thing to be covered in solar panels. So I just say this to illustrate the point. When is enough enough? Because humans have got to get to the point on some things where enough is enough, and we've got to be able to feel satiated and not want even more. So how are we going to bring that about? Who gets the sunlight? This map is to scale for where the sunlight is landing on land, and the color scheme shows you who's got the most sunlight per person. We're looking incredibly skinny and white there. We're the 5th worst country in the world, actually. And Australia's got 200 times more sunlight per person than us. So what are they doing selling coal when they could be just absolutely bathing in solar power? And one of the questions, if you look at what it's going to take to leave the fossil fuel in the ground, I'm very conscious of time, is that we need to share things out. If there's going to be a global arrangement, and there needs to be a global arrangement to leave the fuel in the ground, somehow it's got to work for everybody. And I won't discuss it now, but it's got to work for Russia, it's got to work for China, it's got to work for the USA, it's got to work for the USA. Luckily, these countries also have sunlight. Some of these countries don't. But there's a whole kind of question of that negotiation. How can that negotiation be done? And can it be done in a world in which it's so unequal as it is at the moment, and in which there's the respect with which countries are treating each other is at the state it's in. I just put this up to reassure people in the UK, because if you do the who's got the wind analysis, you find out we're a little bit more filled out and colourful. Very quickly, some stuff on travel and transport. There's our rising travel. This is the driving, and this is the flying in white down here. And those are the two things we most need to worry about. We don't know how to put planes in the air without fossil fuel, and the driving. Talk about in the book. Just quickly, come the sustainable world, almost all travel is going to require land in some way or other. So a square metre of land, how many person miles could you get out of a square metre of land for different uses? So this is grow some grass, a cellulose crop, a second generation biofuel, more efficient than first generation, and put it into a car. A square metre of sunny Californian land, get you 5 miles. There's a piece of string to illustrate it there. Alternatively, grow wheat, turn it into bread and feed a cyclist. How far could you get? 25 miles, that's better. The bike wins, of course. Put a solar panel on it and drive an electric car. How far would you get? There you go. 1,000 miles. That's good, isn't it? OK. What about solar-powered bike? Here we are, 21,000 miles. Bit sad, actually. I'd like to see this one winning. But there we go. You've got to go with the facts sometimes. I'll still be on this one. OK. So the green stuff, just onto the blue, the stuff in blue, and what would it take for us to be sorting this out? I'm just going to touch on things. So some people say all growth's bad, all growth's essential. I think the way to frame it up is what growth is bad, can't we have any more of? Greenhouse gas emissions, no, definitely not. Meat consumption, not. GDP growth, probably not, looks very dangerous at best, but perhaps I can theoretically imagine a world with GDP growth in which we will be sustainable. It's possible to imagine it. Population, tricky, but we can have a bit of population growth, the less the better. I talk about that. It's not the single issue that some people frame it up as. But let's have a look at the top end. Maybe there's some stuff that we absolutely have to grow at high speed. We have to grow things like our capacity for global empathy, our mindfulness, our ability to do systems thinking. It's good for us. We can still think about growing human well-being. That's still okay to aspire to grow. So it's not a question of we can't grow anymore. It's just a question of we have to change the flavor of our growth a lot. Very quickly on inequality, just why are most Americans so much poorer than most Italians? So this is the wealth per person in America. Aren't there, one of the richest countries in the world, and here's Italy right down here and Spain there. But what if you look at the median wealth? That's the wealth of somebody with as many people richer than them as poorer than them in the world. So I'll put that up in yellow. And suddenly the States is right down here with most people poorer than most people in Spain, most people in Italy. So, life is pretty rubbish for a lot of people in the States in a way that we don't hear about. And we're a bit like the States, but not quite as extreme. It's the same for a lot of things. And just more on inequality, so to raise the point, if you just trim these guys down, these 10 people down to being billionaires, so we're not going to inflict too much suffering, that would be enough to quadruple the wealth of the poorest half of Africa. But I make the inequality point, not just because it'd be nice to have a more equal world, but because if you look at what it would take to come to some of the global arrangements that are required to handle some of the global challenges we've got, it looks impossible to deal with them from a practical point of view whilst there's still this level of inequality going on. Moving on sort of quickly, so truth and trust, and there's a whole chapter on this in the book, but we need to raise our standards of truth and trust. Everything's so complex now, it's easier than ever to hide the truth and obscure it. But we need to get sharper than ever, dramatically sharper at discerning when we're getting the full story, an accurate story, And we need to get better than ever at insisting on it, so that if we're not getting it, we change our media source and we vote differently, and everybody knows we're doing that, and politicians who are careless with the truth get pulled up on it so hard that their careers start faltering and so on. It's amazing how many people I've talked to who will agree with me over a cup of coffee, technical experts, scientific experts. They say, well, actually, you know what, at the end of the day, if you want to sort this stuff out, whether it's climate change or the feeding the world or whatever, at the end of the day, perhaps it comes back to a simple values debate. And I'm not going to talk about these values from I'm not an ethics professor, or I've got no great credentials for talking about values, except from a really pragmatic point of view. What values will help us, enable us to deal with the Anthropocene challenge that we're in, and which values won't? And I think that you can just say it very simply. There are three, and the good news is we can deliberately do things to create these values as cultural norms. So three values. So the first is that all people are of equal inherent value, wherever they are in the world, however rich they are, whatever they've done, whatever, anything. Second is to extend that to other life forms, respect them not just as servants of humanity, but in their own right. And the third, to respect truth for its own sake, even if it's inconvenient and even when it doesn't support the cause that we're wedded to. And the good news is we can deliberately change those. So there we go. Quick tour of the stuff in blue. And then finally, the concluding chapter, are there some thinking skills that we need to really grow fast? And here are the 8. So we need to get much better at thinking of looking at the big picture. We need to get much better at joining everything up, as I've tried to do in this book, in an imperfect way. Much better at global empathy, because we're all in this together, like it or not now. We're on one planet together. Much better at thinking further into the future. Much better at appreciating small and local things in the here and now, so we don't have to get our kicks by getting on aeroplanes, for example. In terms of truth, much better at self-reflection, so we can understand what our own motivations are for believing what we believe and listening to this argument instead of that. Much better at critical thinking, so we can discern fact from fiction. Complexity and complicatedness we're getting better at anyway, so we don't need to think about that. But so those are probably the 7 we need to concentrate on the most. I don't put these up as things I'm expert on all of at all, but I just identify them as things we all need to get better at as best we can. And then finally, this is I think it's a valid question to ask when it's all so global. What can I do? Each one of us is only 1/7.5 billionth of the world. So, and it's all this global dynamics going on. Maybe the individual can't do anything. I don't think that's the case at all. But what can you do? And I think it boils down to this. First of all, we need to imagine the better world, because we do have the opportunity to live better than ever. This is not a hair shirt exercise. Actually, it's a chance to liberate ourselves and actually live better, but we need to spend more time imagining it. We need to role model things as best we can, sustainable living as best we can. And the reason why that's important is partly because we learn about the macro through our experience of doing it in the micro. And it's partly because it brings integrity to everything we do. And it's partly because, by role modeling, we spiral things out, we influence other people. So, but none of us are perfect. It's not about beating ourselves up, but it's not about letting ourselves off the hook either. We need to develop the thinking skills and the values that I've said as best we possibly can and help others to do likewise. Apart from how we live ourselves, it's about how we influence. And this is where you really can affect your change, is to ask, what are all the situations in which I can have influence over the whole system to get the system change I want? And of course, it starts with how I vote, but it's also how I influence my politicians, the media I support, where I put my money, what I invest in. Every time you spend money, you invest in one future or another. So there's a whole myriad of ways in which we have influence. What about schools? What about how I go to work? What about the company I work for? All of that. We've had decades of asking nicely, and it is time to insist, and we need to insist that our politicians take this stuff seriously. We need to insist that they're that their policies are coherent, and when they're not coherent, we need to say, is it that you hadn't spotted that this is incoherent, or is it that you hoped we didn't spot that it was incoherent? And either way, it makes you unfit for office. So kind of which is it, or do you need to do some new thinking? And we need to make, we can make it like that, but we just need to not be lazy about, we need to not put up with rubbish. And then I just put this down, last. I don't say this lightly. I think it has, it is scary now. We should be scared about the stuff we're hearing, and more so than I would have said 5 years ago or even 1 year ago. And I think this needs to be really clever, intelligent protesting. And I think by and large, Extinction Rebellion did a fantastic job of that, for example, and the school kids likewise. But somehow, it's not been enough just to ask, and we do need the change. So there's some cause for hope. The traction of the Green New Deal and Extinction Rebellion with their, those values of respect and truth and so on, I think were great. And the school kids just demanding a better future, and the climate emergency is coming up everywhere, and we've got at least one Anthropocene fit MP, and there are signs for hope. It's a very interesting moment, scary but interesting. And I'll stop there. Thank you. How did I do? Sorry, that was as short as I could do it. I'm working on keeping it short.
I could have quite happily sat and listened, but we have a format, and we have to stick to it. Let's cut to the chase. There's not a thing that you said that I don't loudly applaud and absolutely agree with. The challenge that we are facing right now in the Food Farming Countryside Commission, as I'm writing my recommendations for ministers to be presented next week in the sneak preview, is how we move from what I think is increasingly a sense of shared intention to real practical action. Because what I also see alongside that increasing anxiety and realisation and intention is a global economic system that is stuck. And so when we talk to farmers, when we talk to food processors, when we talk to, say, the Nestlés of this world, whose whole global business model is on processing food so that it's even more unhealthy for planet and for people, what are the really, really practical things that we can say to governments and to businesses that help them disinvest, change their business models, and take this challenge really seriously?
Okay, so we so lots of different things to answer there. So first up about the sort of farming. I mean, just to start off with, in this country, we just need a really intelligent discussion that takes account of all the best science, all the human interests, and all the non-human interests. And if we all sit around the table properly together without anyone trying to score points on anyone else, there is an opportunity for the farming community to live better, do better, whilst doing the right thing for the land and all the rest of it. In terms of companies like Nestlé and the whole business community, I mean, there's some really uncomfortable news for some businesses because a lot of change is required. It's no longer acceptable to have a business that primarily exists for profit. It's okay to make some money, it's okay for people to earn a living, but existing for profit just doesn't work in the Anthropocene. It's not okay. And we need to help businesses to reinvent themselves a bit. I think some businesses need escape routes. Some if you're a beef farmer, or if you're I work quite a lot with big tech companies. They've got some serious thinking to do, because if you really look hard at this stuff, it's got implications for what it means for tech, that they've always liked to think, well, that's great, we're part of the low carbon world. Turns out not to be the case, actually. They're part of that dynamics of growth and efficiency and so on. But if you're something like Nestlé, there are hard questions, and anytime any of us spend money, and we all need to tune into this with everything we do with our money, investing and spending, we are supporting with every pound one future or another. And if we can get better at tuning into that.
They tell me privately, and not for public consumption, so just between us,
okay,
that what they really could do with is governments raising the bar. If governments set a much higher regulatory and legislative baseline, that doesn't give them any choice.
Sure. So Okay, good. But we're talking about system change here, right? So where does system change start from? It starts from everywhere, actually. And over the years, I've had so many groups tell me that the first mover is somebody else. You know, businesses tell me they're waiting for their customers, they're waiting for governments, governments saying they're just dependent on their electorate. You know, change comes from everywhere. So everyone needs to push in all the areas in which we have influence. And, you know, I don't know how far this can go, but there's been a lot of change recently, not enough. But, you know, I'm not a determinist about this. It looks like if we all push hard, you know, we might get where we need to go. And certainly we increase the chances.
Okay, thank you. Let's open it up to some questions. We'll start here.
We had a discussion about this in a group that I was in.
Just want to wait for the mic.
Wait for the mic, yeah.
Sorry. We had a discussion about this earlier this week, and I think we reached two conclusions. One is there has to be a much greater realization that the changes we want to have are going to mean a lot of changes in many people's lifestyle. And I think back to 1939, where the Defence of the Realm Act made a fair system so that everybody had enough to eat, but not very much. And we couldn't drive cars. And we accepted this because there was an immediate threat of invasion, which would have been disastrous for people. And this was accepted. But we haven't got to the stage now where we accept that there really is something like this, because life goes on normally, and you don't see this.
Yeah, so we absolutely need to stop life from going on as normal in some ways. I mean, I don't think it's about a hair shirt. So let's take the food thing. So we need to see a lot of change in diet. Actually, that's a health opportunity for a lot of people. And a lot of people who are thinking a meal just can't be great without a chunk of meat in it. Actually, those habits can change, you know, some open-mindedness, and, you know, with one way or another, you know, those people will go on a journey that they will not look back from. And the same goes for if you feel like you can't have a decent holiday without getting on an airplane to the other side of the world to go and stay in a hotel that's as close as you can find to the one down the road from you, where the meals are exactly as close as you can get to the meals you could get down the road. You know, those people too can find that there's opportunities, but we need to imagine it, we need to experiment with it, and yes, we need some pressure and guidance from government.
Hello, my name's Hetty Heinzig, and I've worked in this field for a long, long time, but from a different perspective. I was originally trained as a psychotherapist, a journalist, I'm a writer, etc. Two brief questions. Emotions don't get talked about, and I'd love your take on that. I sat next to a chap on the plane last night, aeroplane, very bad. Coming back from Ireland, a synthetic biologist. He said, I hate emotions. They get us into lots of trouble. Nonetheless, they do exist. They come with a package of being human. And there's an enormous amount of fear, grief, shame, guilt, confusion, etc., etc. That's the sort of area that, you know, the whole area of deep adaptation and so on that I guess I work in. Second thing is, what's your view on GM crops? Because he was, again, it happened yesterday, so it's fresh. He's vociferous in his antipathy for you organic people.
Who's this?
This chap I met on the plane,
Yeah.
who was synthetic. He said, we've got to have GM crops if we're going to feed everybody.
Okay,
Two questions.
Right, so emotions. Well, so I mean, you know, what's the point of being alive if there are no emotions? And there's little bits on psychology in the book, but in a perfect world there'd be more on that, actually. So the whole business of, you know, basic psychological needs and how we meet them and how we meet them better through this change, and the whole business of how people change. And, you know, if you just want to think simply about grief curves and so on, and we're all at different places in that curve, and what do we need at different places? Do we need evidence, or do we need support, or do we need next steps, or what is it? Or do we just need to be understood that it's difficult? You know, maybe that's it. You know, maybe the people who work in fossil fuel companies just need us to understand that we understand that this is tricky news for them, right? So yes, that whole emotional thing. And if this wasn't an emotional challenge, you know, if this was just science and technology, I've told you the good news, we'd have it sorted, it'd be easy, I'd relax, I'd go and do another job, I'd go and whittle sticks on the Scottish Island and have a great time, or something, you know. And GM crops is an interesting example of technology. Right? So the right technology is important for us getting out of the situation we're in. The right new energies, the right, carefully used food technologies could also help us as well. I mean, I fear for the wrong technologies blurted out in the wrong way. If you look at the most effective way of doing, the efficient way of doing our nutrition, it's probably vertical farms powered by electricity from solar panels out in the desert, and the whole thing totally automated, and nothing natural about it. And I kind of, another way of doing it would be to have more people working the land. We've actually got more people in the world than we've ever had before. It takes skill and care to do the right thing with a piece of land to make it productive, biodiverse, and all the other things that we need from it. And what more fulfilling role could there be in the world than to be a really great, careful, sensitive farmer, or working the land in any other way. So technology is not the way out of this. Done in the right way, it can help us. Done in the wrong technologies, we need like a hole in the head. Probably GM can help us a bit if we're really smart about it, but we need to be so smart. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a question here, and then Elliot, if you've got any questions on the Twitter sphere, get ready. Thank you.
Thank you. Very enjoyable talk, very impressive. Terence Bendixson, member of the Society. A question on GDP growth. You're making a very strong case for us having to change our values and change our ways. To a considerable extent, that means education, books like you're writing, people like yourself spreading the word. Do we have enough GDP to do all that education in Africa, in the developing world, or do we need growth in order to achieve the educational program that's necessary? It's a question that's always been in my mind.
Okay, so GDP is just an overrated, abstract human construct. It has no physical bearing at all, right? Well, it's about wealth in monetary terms, but that wealth, doesn't actually necessarily mean anything. If you have a world where nobody will ever do anyone else a favor, GDP goes up because everything's monetized. I mean, it's just... So I could conceive in a world in which we dematerialize everything, the things we're charging for don't actually have any physical resource associated with them, and GDP goes up, fine, like teaching, for example. We pay teachers 10 times as much. Fantastic. So I could conceive of that happening. I think the real thing is that, we're chasing the wrong metrics, right? We need to latch on, if we're going to use metrics, and all metrics need treating with caution, then we need to latch onto the metrics that are much more closely associated with the things that are inherently valuable, like human well-being, ecosystem services, or ecosphere, or whatever you call environment, well-being, all of that stuff, right? And we need to treat all those metrics with caution, because the minute you push too hard on a metric, you start doing perverse things that actually the metric was never intended for. So I think we just need to, and when I talked about values, well, one of the things about focusing too hard on financial metrics is that does push us towards, it does encourage individualistic values that are the opposite of what we need. So we just need, if we're going to have metrics, if we can just focus on other metrics to the point that when someone talks about GDP, the Chancellor stands up and talks about GDP and everyone just yawns at them because they're interested in something else. That's where we need to get it to.
Lovely, thank you. I suspect there's a similar graph to be done as the calorie graph. There's more than enough wealth in the world. It's just really badly distributed.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I mean, it's a total waste. If you give someone $1 billion, it's a total waste of that wealth, right? The link with well-being goes to zero. There's plenty of evidence for that. If it wasn't the case, those 10 faces I showed up there, they'd all be going around in a delirium, wouldn't they, of happiness? I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful for them? But it's not. They're no happier than you or I, right? So it's a complete waste of wealth. Yeah.
I'm going to ask Elliot at the back for some questions from the Twitter sphere.
This is a question from Robert Eade. How can we get the UK public to drastically reduce its meat consumption, carrot or stick?
Both. Both, but mainly carrot. It's actually changing. So you know, around the Lake District, I've noticed this change. So I've been batting away about, you know, what can hotels and pubs do and what can farms do and all the rest of it. And the change is the poshest hotels in the Lake District are saying, we know we want to get on top of this now. It's just a question of our chefs are a bit scared of it. They've been educated for one kind of cooking, and now they find, you know, it's a bit of a scary transition. But if you go eating around the Lake District, you know, I was in a cafe the other day and we were choosing a lunch menu and we've been staring at it for a little while and just go, oh, you know what, there's no meat on this menu at all. It's not calling itself a vegetarian cafe or anything. It just doesn't have. And actually the options are delicious now, right? So it's getting easier, right? And the BBC is even talking about it. Isn't that fantastic? You know, so that's going to have a lot of change. And so we're understanding it's going to be healthier. So I think it's a transition that is waiting to happen. And the reason why, there always used to be status around meat. And historically, there was a good reason for that. Because if you had a restricted diet with only 2 or 3 things in it, and you could add one food to increase your life expectancy, make you healthier, it'd be a meat. But now we've got access to massive varied diets. And all of that historical reason why meat was a good thing has actually gone.
Lovely. I think we've got time for at least one more question. Up in that top corner.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, very credible story from a benefactor of what you call humanity in terms of internet. You gave us free internet. That was a wonderful thing. Yes, but you know that you lamented about a graph, about the carbon emission.
Yes.
They are going as if nothing.
The carbon emission graph hasn't
Yes.
noticed.
Now, but that tells a story. That tells a story of human nature. And human nature is what you call, I mean, most of us do like growth. And so can we not find some, I mean, and also the human ingenuity that you have, that you know very well of. Why can't we use this to find a way of both growing as well as controlling the carbon emission, carbon control, like the sequestration, the carbon dioxide sequestration, and other technology one could think of. So yes, can't we do together, do things, growth as well as the control of
okay. So a few things to cover off there. So first up about human nature. So this thing that gets talked about, it's not fixed, right? It's something we can change, right? So if our nature is not to care about people on the other side of the world, say, enough at the moment, we can change that, actually. We can do things. I talk about this a little bit in the book. I'm not an expert on it particularly, but, you know, there are things we can do to increase the amount that we care about what's going on with people we're never going to meet on the other side of the world. So we can change all of that. And if we're fixated on growth because we've had decades of hearing all our politicians talk about how that's the measure of success for an economy and all the rest of it, actually we can change that. And Kate Raworth is good about this in her book, Donut Economics. You know, when she talks about, you know, our economics affects our values. We can change that. So this business of this growth, you know, it's not helping us. We might be fixated on it, but it is not improving our well-being. So if we can just rid ourselves of an unhelpful fixation, the quality of our lives can go up, not down. That is the key. That is the thing we need to get our heads around.
Another question. Lady.
Hello, I'm Susan Schnadhorst. I'm a sustainability professional in the built environment. I've often wondered whether if we just changed from having money to carbon as the main currency, whether a lot of these things couldn't be solved.
Well, we should link the two up. So if money was linked to environmental burden, it would really help us. So just to be really simple about it, if you say, just to take climate change on its own for a second, right? However you look at it, like I never get in I don't know anyone who can put up a proper argument to say that anything other than we need to leave the world's fossil fuel in the grounds, and that needs a global arrangement to do so. And if we have that, then it needs to be too expensive or illegal, but both actually, to take the fossil fuel out of the ground, right? So that takes you to some kind of carbon price. However you describe it, whether it's a cap and trade or just a tax, or somehow there's to be a price on carbon. And some people say, well, that's just too hard to arrange. But it doesn't matter how hard it is to arrange. Once you've gone through the logic of it and there is no alternative, we may as well focus on how to make it happen. And when you have that carbon price, the nice thing is that it feeds its way through into everything automatically, totally seamlessly. Right? The carbon footprint of everything you buy and do is immediately reflected in the price. And I'm totally with you. We should do all that. Just quickly on carbon pricing and taxes, people look at that as a hair shirt because we have this reaction to tax, but actually a tax is a way of getting revenue in that you can do anything you like with. So if you said to people, everyone in this country can have a £1,000 Christmas present, fantastic. How are we going to do it? Well, we're just going to put the fuel bills up so that they reflect the carbon impact. Right? Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I can handle that. And all you've got to do, so keep some of the money aside for your increased fuel bill, but all you've got to do is be a bit more careful with your fuel consumption and you'll be quids in. Then, so we can use that to incentivize the right behaviours.
Kind of like a basic income.
Well, that gets a discussion in the book. Yeah,
it's
yeah,
a
that
theme
does.
that is very important.
At the very least, it's worth an exploration.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, perhaps two more questions. Let's take there. Elliot, anything else on the Twitter sphere? Or take them in the room? So there, and then we'll come over to you. Yes.
My gas boiler's broken down. What should I do instead of replacing it?
It's very difficult to do the absolute detailed answer to that, but the long-term future is we are getting away from gas, right? So, these decisions depend on how much money you're able to throw at it, right? But if you're able to invest in it, then sort your house out as best you can and get yourself your solar panels on the roof and see if you can get yourself ground source or air source heat pump and see if you can get yourself gas-free. That would certainly be the ideal solution. And I think houses that have done that are going to be more sought after, for sure. Yeah.
Last question from you.
Hi, Mike. My name's Libby Davey. I'm a fellow. I'm a coaching professional and change agent. And I'm a writer. I'm writing a book called Planet Me, which picks up some of these questions of, the emotion and how do we respond from a human point of view. One of the challenges that I'm facing right now is that I'm normally a very, very optimistic person. Pragmatic, but optimistic, okay? And I've been involved with Extinction Rebellion in many aspects of this. Current research I'm doing suggests that there is a scenario that it's too late. Okay, and I'm not one to go there, but I think we need to, yeah. So I wondered if you could respond from the point of view of how do we deal with the scenario that systems collapse is now inevitable, and words like resilience, local economies, and I'm sorry to say, but a kind of a post-apocalyptic scenario is something that responsibly we also need to be talking about. Thank you. And I love the book, as you know. Yeah.
Okay, so lots to respond to there. So first up, the optimism thing or not. Right? I'm optimistic in the sense that it is not proven that we can't deal with this. We actually don't know. People talk about 10 years, 12 years, all the rest of it. We don't know where the thresholds are, where the tipping points are, and all the rest of it. But we do know that the harder we push, the better our chances are of getting through it, and with fewer consequences. So I'm an optimist in the sense that it's not proven we can't. If we all push hard, we can't deal with this. And even if we fail, what we'll feel a lot better about, I think we'll all feel great. If you imagine a world in which we're all suddenly really fighting hard to deal with this stuff, I think we'll feel great about it because we'll know we're doing the right thing, even if it doesn't work. The adaptation thing, I am really wary of that. The people who say it's proven that we've got a catastrophe coming up, it's not. The people, and I think my fear is, if a crisis hits us, we'll adapt, right? We'll get on that war footing that we know how to do, and we'll scupple around and all the rest of it. But if we think that doing that will deal with the problem, it won't. If all we do is adapt, we will just get ourselves into more and more and more problem, and the amount that we have to adapt will just escalate faster than our adaptation rate, and it'll all go horribly wrong. So I don't at the moment really want to see us particularly doing any adaptation effort, lest it's at the expense of any mitigation effort, because that's where the pressure needs to be.
With
With global governance. We need to get the global governance, but there's stuff we do on the small scale to make sure that the global governance, to help the global governance to happen.
Brilliant, thank you. That was absolutely inspiring and provocative and challenging, and we will carry on talking in all sorts of ways separate from that. Just by way of finishing, I think that last question that you asked is a really, really important one. When I talked to my good friend Margaret Wheatley, who's been talking about this stuff and working on this stuff for 30 years now, 10 years ago she said to me, it's time to give up optimism, it's time to give up hope, it's time to give up all of those things. The most important thing that we can do is act. And we have to, at some level, find the capacity to decouple ourselves at moments of crisis from our unhelpful emotional responses and just focus on what we have to do right now. And the thing that I do find really inspiring and encouraging is that that sense of mission embodied in Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg, I'm hearing shared around government and around my commission table, pillars of business, pillars of the community, who are saying to me right now, Sue, up our game. It's time for action. It's time to be on a mission for change. We have to take our leadership wherever we can. We'll be calling for revolution. Now, I can't tell you how happy that makes me. So thank you for coming. Thank you for your encouragements and your guidance and your plan. Look forward to much more of this.